Okay, thank you everyone who has come along to this webinar today. My name is Luke Howard. I am the technical coordinator here at the Plan Vivo Foundation, and I'm your host for today's webinar on the Plan Vivo Biodiversity Standard, also known as PV Nature. It's great to see how much interest there has been in this webinar, and I think it shows that there is significant enthusiasm in this emerging biodiversity space. And this is very promising, and we hope that we are on the verge of a surge in global income through these markets into biodiversity conservation and restoration projects. Now, just a bit of housekeeping before we go any further. Everyone is on mute, but you are more than welcome to submit any questions that you may have via the Q&A box either at the bottom or the top of your screen. The webinar is approximately 60 minutes long for the presentation side of things, and then we will move into a Q&A session for the remainder of the period, hopefully around 30 minutes, in which we will answer as many of those questions as possible. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website from tomorrow, so you're more than welcome to rewatch any sections or share them with colleagues or friends. And the documents that we are referring to today and further information will be available on our website also from tomorrow for access. Included in this will be a feedback form, which will form part of this public consultation, so you can provide any feedback you have on these documents. And we will be sending out a reminder email after this webinar for all attendees on where to find this information. Just to give you an idea about what's coming up ahead, first we're going to have a bit of background to the Plan Vivo Foundation. We're aware that many people here might understand who Plan Vivo is and know us from the voluntary carbon markets, but we're also aware that some people we might be a fairly new organisation to them. So we want to provide a bit of background about ourselves. And then we're going to go and look at the development historically of the biodiversity standard, the introduction to it, how we have got to this point now. Then we will dive into the detail of this standard, or this draft standard for public consultation, looking at the project requirements, the biodiversity methodology, and the validation and verification requirements. From there, the final section in our presentation, we will talk about the registration process and next steps for anyone who might be interested in both registering a project or what might the process be for projects, but also what is the next steps in this public consultation, what can we expect going forwards. And then finally, we will end the webinar with that Q&A session that we were talking about, which again, you can place any questions that you have into the Q&A box at the top or bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to answer them. We won't be able to get through all of them. I'm already want to set those expectations, but we will get through as many as we can, and we can provide ways to follow up with questions after the webinar if necessary. So I'm going to hand over to Keith now, who's going to provide some information about the Plan Vivo Standard and our team. So over to you, Keith.
Thanks very much, Luke. And yeah, just to echo Luke's welcome, it's fantastic to see so many people joining us today from all over the world and so much interest in this space. I would like to start by just introducing you to the Plan Vivo team working on this initiative. So there's myself, the CEO, there's Evie Ward, who's our Blue Carbon Coordinator, and Evie's been working as part of the team developing the requirements documentation. Also Harry, who's also been part of that team and has been working particularly on the pilot projects. Diana has been heading up our media and comms, including promoting this webinar. Luke, who you've met already, is our technical coordinator. Luke's been heavily involved in the requirements documentation development, but also in the methodology development and in adapting the methodology from the Wallacea Trust. Toral's our biodiversity coordinator, so she's pulling all this together. And Kristen Olsen has been supporting us, particularly on the market analysis, and we'll have some slides on that today, and also on the social impact side. So that's the Plan Vivo team, but as I'm sure you're aware, and even a lot of you are on this call, this is not just Plan Vivo effort. There's a lot of people involved. I mentioned Wallacea Trust, who've developed the methodology which we're adapting in the standard. We also have a biodiversity working group with stakeholders from project developers, from conservation organizations, from market actors, from communities. So we have a lot of people contributing to this. As Luke said, while a lot of you are familiar with Plan Vivo, we wanted to take some time just to remind people who we are and where we're coming from. So Plan Vivo is a charitable foundation, and also we're a voluntary carbon market standard. We've been operating for the last 25 years, and our focus is very much on supporting communities and smallholders. We believe very strongly that working with communities and smallholders who are at the sharp edge of climate change, it's the right thing to do, but also we believe it's the best thing to do in terms of achieving lasting impact. And the whole Plan Vivo model and approach has been developed around that model. So we put smallholders and communities at the center of the design process. So it's a participatory and inclusive process where they're actively involved in the project design, rather than somebody else coming with an already designed project and copy pasting it. A unique feature of the Plan Vivo standard is, as part of our requirements, we ensure that at least 60% of the revenue generated from the sale of carbon credits must go back to the communities and smallholders. This is the only standard to have that as a requirement. And another key aspect of what we do is, while we're operating in the voluntary carbon market and while we're generating Plan Vivo certificates, which are carbon credits, our projects also need to show that they're having benefits in terms of co-benefits, or core benefits as we like to call them, in terms of having impact for people and also impact for biodiversity. Just a little bit about where this fits into our overall strategy, which we call Scaling with Care. All of you are here because of such interest and growth in the space. And we believe that Plan Vivo model can be scaled up, and it has been on many of our carbon projects. But we want to do it in a way which stays true to the values of Plan Vivo. So what we're aiming for through all the work we do in the carbon standard and now in the biodiversity standard is to have resilient communities, resilient nature, and reducing the impact of climate change globally and at scale. We believe the way to achieve that is for communities to have increased, transparent, and equitable access to responsible finance. And at the moment, that's been done primarily through the voluntary carbon market. So one thing we're looking to do is to strengthen the Plan Vivo model. That's growing our organization. It's also growing our regional presence. And it's also looking at positioning Plan Vivo in some of the broader discussions, particularly around policy and around influence in spaces where we can try and create an enabling environment for projects to access these markets. Secondly, is directly supporting those communities to access the markets. And as a standard, we are not directly involved in project development, but we are very keen to build capacity with project developers and communities to enable them to access the market. So we're working very hard on that. We're also working very hard on creating an enabling environment where those projects can get the support and the services they need to develop successful projects. And the last pillar is really looking at the services we offer, and this is really what we're talking about today. So we have the Plan Vivo Carbon Standard. We also have an exciting partnership with Rabobank on Acorn, which is about using innovative approaches for smallholder agroforestry. And now we bring you PV Nature, which will be our first ever dedicated biodiversity standard. So maybe at this point worth saying, why are Plan Vivo particularly interested in biodiversity, as we're known as a carbon standard? Well, I don't really need to lecture this group here about the importance of biodiversity and the huge biodiversity loss that's happening at the moment. So there's definitely a need, a demand to do something. And we feel this fits very well with our expertise and experience. as I mentioned earlier, it's a requirement of the carbon standard that all of our projects have positive biodiversity impact. Indeed, some of our projects have won awards for the amount of biodiversity monitoring and impact they're able to demonstrate. So biodiversity isn't new to us. It's more really about framing things in a different way. Also, again, as mentioned earlier about this holistic approach, we believe that carbon or climate impact, biodiversity impact, and social impact all need to be addressed in the same project. You can't have one without the other. So trying to address climate impact without addressing biodiversity doesn't work. That's what we fundamentally believe in, and equally the other way around. So we feel this fits very well. And also we feel it offers us an alternative business model, both for Plan Vivo, the organization, and for projects, because many of our projects are accessing as a carbon project because they don't have alternatives. And this, for many of our projects that are working in really important spaces and habitats for biodiversity, this could be a great funding stream for them and a great way for them to deliver real impact on the ground. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the market. And again, some people on this call, I'm sure, will be representing different aspects of that market. These slides were put together by Kristen, so thanks to her for that, because she's been heading up our work in this space. So first of all, what do we know about the market for biodiversity credits, or certificates as we call them? Well, it's an emerging market, but it's growing very rapidly, both in terms of interest and in terms of scale. And part of that is in response to the urgency of the biodiversity crisis. And obviously that's very much front and center, especially at discussions like COP15, where we now have the Kunding Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So we have this kind of alliance, this kind of movement towards really addressing biodiversity and trying to look for market solutions to try and channel finance into that space. There are many studies quoting how much that financial gap is. I'm quoting one here, which says it's a 700 billion gap per annum in terms of nature financing. There are many others, some more than that, some less than that, but there's certainly a huge gap. And so we see that as an opportunity here, but also we feel it has to be done in a very clear, very transparent, and it must be very much about high integrity. And that's the message we've got back from speaking with market actors as well. So that fits nicely with our approach already. Whoops, sorry. So of course, while Plan Vivo in some ways here is pioneering in terms of us probably being the first biodiversity standard to go to market here, we're not the only ones working in this space. And there's a lot going on in terms of development to meet this market demand. So I thought useful just to highlight some points here. There's a lot of work going on around standards and guidelines for high integrity biodiversity certificates or credits. We have our own work, and over and above the standard development itself, we've done some work recently with FFI and Carbon Tanzania about trying to put together some guidance on what we feel high integrity means. And we'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. There's also people like the World Economic Forum and the UNDP through their Biodiversity Credit Alliance doing a lot of work here and a lot of focus on high integrity, which we're really pleased with. There's also been work on tools and methods for measuring biodiversity impact. This has always been a challenge, particularly in trying to have methods where you can compare a biodiversity impact in two very different ecoregions. And yeah, we're delighted to partner with the Wallacea Trust and Operation Wallacea, who've developed this methodology around a basket of matrices, which you'll hear more about from Luke, which we feel tackles some of these challenges and fits really well with the Plan Vivo approach. There's also financial tools and frameworks trying to, again, manage risk and de-risk financial investments. There's a number of organizations working on that. there's the Science-Based Targets Networks, and there's the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. So lots of effort, lots of discussions in this space, and hopefully lots of finance channeling too through. And we want to make sure that we position Plan Vivo Nature as a way to channel that finance, and again, to make sure that that finance flows down to the people who need it most, which are the communities on the ground who are living in these spaces. There's also been a number of pilot schemes. Again, we've got our own pilots as part of this development, which you'll hear more about from Turrell. And there's others in this space, partners and we work with in New Zealand called ECOS have also developed their own initiative called Sustainable Development Units, which also has a strong biodiversity element. So lots happening in this space, and seems like a very good time to try and develop something to fit in to meet this demand. So just to touch on that point about high integrity and what do we mean. So we felt, obviously the team has been working hard to develop the standard, the documentation, what are the requirements projects would need to meet to generate biodiversity certificates, to create those in the market that could be sold. But kind of underpinning all that is what would have to be met in terms of saying or claiming to have high integrity. And for us, we felt it's very much centered around the idea of this holistic approach of having very clear and tangible benefits for nature or biodiversity, and that should be aligned with already existing initiatives, with local and national frameworks, and that should really deliver benefits for biodiversity that, as in the carbon market, need to be real and they need to be verified. So as all of you, I'm sure, are aware, lots of criticisms around carbon markets, around making sure that the benefits are real and that they can be delivered. And I think it's the same here in the biodiversity world. But what's different, I think, for us in this space is we're not positioning these biodiversity certificates to be used as offsets. We see this as a different market. We see this as a way to create positive incentivization to conserve and restore important habitats. So we're not aiming this at an offset market, which I think is an important distinction. So we have this holistic approach. We also want to make sure that everything is really transparent and accountable. So that's in terms of the benefit sharing, but also in terms of how the whole process is managed. Particularly, you heard a lot at COP15 about respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and we see that obviously as core to what we're doing. And also we want to make sure that that climate impact or potential for climate impact is also being maximized as well. So it's not just about delivering biodiversity impact, which of course is the main drive of this, but also has to have a positive impact on climate, and that also has to be done in a coordinated way. So for more on that, afterwards you can click that link. We have more details on our website, and you may have seen some of it got picked up by some of the press and Carbon Pulse as well. So to finish off, or just to summarize, I think, what we're looking for here, what we're looking to do with Plan Vivo Nature is to develop an offering in the biodiversity space, which is very much aligned with the Plan Vivo core values. And that fits with our scaling with care approach. We want to make sure that this really is a vehicle to channel responsible finance to communities, and that any credits or certificates generated here are high integrity. And we want to really build on the learning from 25 years in the voluntary carbon market on what's worked well, like, for example, replicating this idea of having a strong V&V process, issuing credits or certificates on a registry that can be very clear, and that all the benefits are real, additional, and verifiable. But also, we'd like to move away from the offset approach in biodiversity for what we offer, and focus more on the nature positive movement. So that's an overview of where we are. I'll pass you back now to Turrell and Luke to give you a bit more detail about what we're planning. But thanks again for joining us.
Okay, thanks, Keith, and good afternoon or good evening, everybody, from wherever you're joining us. Thanks for joining. So I'm going to take you through the process of developing PV Nature. Starting in late 2021, we partnered with the Wallacea Trust to scope out the application for a biodiversity quantification methodology in line with the Biodiversity Standard. And this followed by setting up a Plan Vivo Biodiversity Standard Working Group or Steering Committee, which consists of about 20 members, including biodiversity specialists, academics, experienced project developers, different market actors, and conservation organizations. Shortly after, in March 2022, we received an initial set of pilot project applications, and these were largely focused on the biodiversity metric and monitoring side of it. And this was really helpful for allowing us to understand how to best align our biodiversity objectives within the core Plan Vivo values and within our standard. So the subsequent months followed by the development of the first draft of PV Nature with support and guidance from our working group and the decision to keep it very closely aligned to our core values and our carbon standard version 5. In September 2022, we reinvited a selected number of pilot projects now to apply to PV Nature in line with our project requirements. And I will talk more a little bit about the pilot projects later in the presentation. So towards the end of last year, as the progress of the standard continued, it became more apparent that in order to deliver robust biodiversity projects that have credible benefits, we needed to investigate the biodiversity market section a little deeper. So we put together a biodiversity markets working group with different market actors, including resellers, investors, development agencies, and conservation organizations, to really help us understand where the demand is and how we can best provide projects that deliver on that demand. So finally, over the last 2 months, we have been working closely with our pilot projects to continue to develop their project design and project logic, including the technical side of the biodiversity monitoring and metrics, and also the external review process. Which really brings us to today, where we're holding this webinar to launch the public consultation process and welcome feedback and comments from yourselves on all the key documentation and the adapted biodiversity methodology. So to introduce you to some of the key documentation, I'm going to start with the project requirements. This document is made up of 5 key sections. First is the eligible interventions, which looks at the project interventions and the different land management rights. You then have the stakeholder engagement, which details requirements around the stakeholder analysis, project management, the participatory design of the project, including the free prior informed consent process known as FPIC. The third section is the project design, which outlines baselines, theory of change throughout the project, technical specifications, and more. The fourth section is monitoring and reporting, which includes details about the biodiversity, socioeconomic and environmental metrics and indicators that have been chosen throughout the project. And finally, governance and structure, which, as the name suggests, details the governance structure of the project, the legal and regulatory compliance framework, and the financial plan. So the project requirements look something similar to this, where each of the requirements is individually outlined, and key terms are italicized, which are all defined in our glossary. You also may find some additional guidance below each of the specific requirements. So I thought, since the project requirements are quite a detailed document, which will be available on our website for download tomorrow, I thought this would be still a good opportunity to highlight a few key themes that you can find throughout our requirements. And the first is ensuring a participatory approach. So this is a very core value to Plan Vivo, and we try to emphasize this throughout our projects and throughout the standard. It's largely addressed in the first 3 sections, where we want to see that the management rights of the project area is clearly defined, that there has been a comprehensive and detailed stakeholder consultation process, The project interventions, where possible, must be implemented by project participants that reside within the project region, and that all the local stakeholders have had ample opportunity to feed into the biodiversity metric selection and the overall project design. So we are exploring these requirements under different routes and models, and when that is the case, additional requirements may apply. All of these, again, are very much outlined in our documentation. So another key area I wanted to highlight is the benefit sharing mechanism. Keith has already touched on this a little bit, but again, to emphasize, this is a core Plan Vivo value that we want to see in all our projects. It's outlined in the 4 main sections in bold there. And what we want to see is that all the income from the sale of Plan Vivo biodiversity certificates must be distributed according to an agreed benefit sharing mechanism. With those benefits, at least 60% of that income must be directly going to the project participants and other local stakeholders. We want to have annual reports that include a summary of the biodiversity benefits achieved and also an explanation if there was any deviation from the benefit sharing mechanism, with the financial plan consistent with that mechanism and the overall project logic. This being a biodiversity standard, another key area to highlight is the biodiversity metrics and monitoring aspect. So we will talk more about the methodology in detail further down this presentation, but just to highlight that the biodiversity metrics must be selected according to the conservation objectives of the region, particularly in consultation with the local stakeholders. And these metrics must be outlined in the technical specifications, where details around the monitoring procedures and the data processing procedures must be explained. So Plan Vivo biodiversity certificates can only be issued after a verification, which will take place at least every 5 years throughout the project period. But again, more details on verification and validation to be shared shortly. And finally, progress indicators must be used to assess whether the project interventions and the risk mitigation measures are carried out as planned, which will be done on an annual basis and reported out through the annual reports, whereby the progress indicators must capture basic aspects of the progress towards the expected biodiversity, socioeconomic, and environmental benefits. So the last section, or the last theme rather, that I wanted to highlight is managing key risks. And it's detailed in the following bolden sections there, which we have requirements to ensure that there has been a comprehensive screening and incorporation of environmental and social safeguards, including an exclusion list. We also want to make sure there's been equal opportunities throughout the project development. So we account for key risks such as leakage, double counting, and additionality. And we want to see that all project participants have entered into a project agreement with the coordinator according to the FPIC process. Finally, we are exploring alternative land tenure models where more than 30% of the project area is not community owned. When this is the case, there's further requirements, including that primary stakeholders primary stakeholders, including project participants and local communities, must agree on the distribution of that 60% that should directly be given to community wealth and well-being. So I think at this stage, I will hand over back to Luke.
Thank you very much, Toril. We've looked at the project requirements. That's one of the main documents. Toril has just gone through that, and now I'm going to help dive into a bit more detail around the other core documents in this biodiversity standard. The first one of which is the methodology. Now, as Keith has said previously, this methodology was developed by the Wallacea Trust. This is a charity based in the UK, or headquartered in the UK, that operates on a global level, and it's a biodiversity focused organisation. They set up a working group between 2021 and 2022 that comprised of academics, NGOs, government bodies, consultancies, financial institutions, and ourselves to help with the development of such a methodology. But despite it having such a wide range of actors within this new emerging space, I think it's quite useful to emphasize that this was driven primarily by ecologists at the end of the day. They were ecologists that work within the space in different areas around the world that helped create a methodology that can be applied in almost any scenario around the world that would be possible to align with as a project selecting metrics, and also would provide a good representation of biodiversity in those areas. With that being said, though, it was also developed in a way that applied best practice from the voluntary carbon market. So where possible, we tried to take the learning that the voluntary carbon market has acquired over the past 20 years and mold this methodology in such a way that that would apply that best practice. It is undergoing a peer review process through a research team at the University of Nottingham. And I think it's important to say that the document that we will be publishing on our website from tomorrow has been adapted for use under PV Nature. So you might notice that the version on the Wallacea website is slightly different than the version that we have. There might be some different sections or new sections. That's because we've adapted it specifically for use under our standard. Now, the full detail of this document will be available on our website from tomorrow. I'm repeating things, I apologize. We've said it a few times, but I wanted to explain some of the core features in this presentation, the things that I think people here today would find most interesting. And the first part of this is this basket of metrics. It's arguably the main feature of this methodology. So what is this basket of metrics? Well, I think a realization that we came to fairly early on is that there is no biodiversity equivalent of the carbon dioxide molecule that can be used in the biodiversity markets. Specifically, in the way that a carbon dioxide molecule is can be seen as equal across all projects and equated to different greenhouse gases, we cannot find that that metric in the biodiversity world. There's no one metric that can be equal across all projects. So if that's the case, then what is the alternative solution? Well, another approach is that we follow something similar to that was pioneered by the Retail Price Index, which uses a basket of goods and services different by each country that is specific to what they buy within that country. So why not use the same approach for biodiversity certificates? So this methodology requires that projects choose at least 5 metrics that reflect the conservation objectives of the ecoregion that the project is submitted within, but also the objectives of that country itself. And I will go into a bit more detail in a moment about the different types of metrics, but I wanted to highlight that there are different ways, kind of checks and balances within these metrics and within the methodology that tailor these metrics to ones that are more appropriate. For example, for abundance-based metrics, which I'll explain more in a moment, greater weight is given to species of higher threat status. So meaning that projects are more likely to target species that are in greater need of conservation or restoration. And a biodiversity certificate within this methodology is defined as a 1% uplift or avoided loss per hectare in the median value of the basket of metrics. So taking the median value helps prevent a project just focusing on one metric alone to help increase the number of biodiversity certificates that they can generate. And the per hectare approach allows this to be scaled across larger projects. So if a project works across greater areas, then they would generate more biodiversity certificates for any percentage increase or avoided loss in the biodiversity levels. But what can these metrics be? That's probably the next question in people's minds, or one of. So the metrics can be very varied, but I wanted to give examples of some of the different types that can be applied here. We have abundance-based metrics that work with species and population data. We could have weight-based metrics where there's large catches of species richness. For example, in metabarcoding, if there's a catch with a very large species richness, it can be quite hard to distinguish the individual population of each species. Therefore, projects can apply a form of species richness times weight to get an idea of the biodiversity level. And then another example is index metrics, those that are already in forms of ratios, such as reef rugosity. Now, I think the most common form that projects would be interested in or want to apply are these abundance-based metrics, the ones that look at species and population levels. So I think it's good to highlight that abundance-based metrics must comprise of large assemblages of species. We cannot rely on just individual species. So they could look at breeding birds, they could look at amphibians within an area, maybe microinvertebrates. And where a project is going to be influencing the ecosystem services within a project area or project region, we would encourage them to select metrics that can cover those ecosystem services that are being influenced. So, for example, if a project is improving air quality, we would encourage them maybe to look at lichen populations and the health of those populations as a metric and indicator of the air quality changing. It should also be mentioned that for terrestrial sites, there must be a requirement of at least one habitat metric so that it gives an indication of the wider ecosystem status. So where can this biodiversity methodology be applied, and where can these projects be applied under the PV Nature? Well, the idea and the benefit of this methodology is that it has the flexibility to work on a global level in any ecosystem. Well, this is how it has been designed. And we want it to work in for projects that are, we call them uplift projects, so those that increase biodiversity levels against the baseline, or avoided loss projects, those that conserve biodiversity through mitigating threats to that biodiversity. And just to help visualize this a bit more, I'll show you a couple of examples now of what the metrics could be. And these are just hypothetical with some ideas that have been taken from the pilot projects that Torvald will talk about later. So in one situation, imagine we have a cloud forest and they are looking to conserve the biodiversity levels against ongoing threats. What type of metrics could they use? Well, first off, we could have a habitat metric that looks at the forest cover using satellite imagery. This would be an indice metric as well. So it could look at what would be the natural habitat within that area as a percentage of the total area to understand if there's any decrease in the percentage of natural habitat over time. And ideally, the project wants to completely halt that. And then we could have a few different abundance-based metrics. So one that looks at invertebrates and fish communities, another looking at terrestrial invertebrates, one looking at amphibians, and a final one looking at reptiles. And each one using appropriate ways to sample the data. So one is looking at eDNA in watercourses, another using malaise traps, and then two of them are using transects. And I think it's important to highlight in this what I was talking about earlier, in that these are abundance-based metrics that try to work across large assemblages of species rather than just individual species. So giving a better representation of the biodiversity within that ecosystem. Then on the other side, let's have another example. We're going to look at a marine site, and this is going to be a restoration project. So a marine site that has been badly degraded, looking to restore the levels of biodiversity. What could their metrics be? So in this example, we're going to look at the total species richness and abundance of breeding seabirds, the total species richness and abundance of invertebrates using eDNA. We'll have a look at coral cover using multispectral camera analysis, the total species richness and biomass of juvenile fish through surveys, and total density of commercially exploited invertebrate species, such as oysters, such as lobsters, using benthic collectors. So hopefully that just gives you a flavour of the types of scenarios that we envisage that this standard can operate within. So that's the methodology. Like I said earlier, this will be available on the website from tomorrow. We encourage you to take a look. I'm going to now move over to the next and final key document of the standard, which is the validation and verification requirements. Now, I'm aware that many people in the webinar today will be familiar with how validations, verifications, audits, etc. happen within the voluntary carbon market. And that is something that we've tried to take and adapt to this biodiversity standard, but some changes have had to be made for reasons that I will explain shortly. However, I'm also aware that some people here might not be familiar with those processes, so I'll try and break down each little section in detail or quick detail as a summary for time reasons, and explain what all these processes mean. So when a project is submitting to become registered against PV Nature, they will need to create a project design document. Now, this is a document that describes everything to do with the project, what its plans are, its governance models, etc., and also the metrics that it is proposing to apply under the methodology. Now, these metrics are then reviewed by appropriate expert reviewers from the expert review network. What is the expert review network? What are expert reviewers? I'm going to take a step back already from this just to explain what these are. So we realized fairly early on that the level of expertise needed to review almost any metric in any ecosystem type around the world on a global level is going to be much higher than the level of expertise that's often needed in the voluntary carbon market for our follow projects. Therefore, we needed to create a system that could review these metrics and provide confidence to the projects that what they are planning is appropriate. So we're setting up this expert review network. And this comprises on one side of the expert review panel. This consists of specialist reviewers who are one-off expert reviewers in the specific context of a project, including the habitats and biota that the project interventions are influencing. And these are supported by core reviewers, those who have greater understanding of the methodology, Plan Vivo values and approaches, and broad understanding of biodiversity and monitoring techniques. And this is the main part of the review network who will be reviewing the metrics. But there will be some level of oversight from another group called the Expert Advisory Panel. Now, this is made up of the Plan Vivo Secretariat and supervisory panel members, and its aim is to act much like an editorial board of an academic journal. But together, these will create the expert review network, which can help us to assess the appropriateness of suggested metrics suggested metrics from projects before they can become registered under PV Nature. So that was a step away. We're going to go back into the document again. So the core of this document, the first process, the first section in it is this expert review process using that network that I just talked about. And they will assess the appropriateness of the metrics as a representation of biodiversity, whether the threat rankings for abundance-based metrics are appropriate as well. They pull them from appropriate databases. And are there correct monitoring of data collection and also data processing methods described within those within the project design document? And then the project must pass this stage before it can move on to validation, which is the next stage in the registration process of projects, which I will talk about now. So validation. Those who are familiar with the carbon markets, again, will know what validation and verification means, but it does change slightly in this scenario, which I will explain now. In the validation stage, a validator will assess the accuracy, the completeness, the quality, the veracity of the information recorded in that project design document. So checking how correct it is. But they will also check that the project coordinator and the participants all have the capacity on the ground. So it's a kick of the tires to check that the project has been set up appropriately. The validation will include, therefore, a desk-based review and a site visit, and this can be completed by a validation or verification body, also known as a VVB, or through a combination of Plan Vivo and an independent expert. I'm going to explain the differences and the justifications for those two routes in a moment once we get to point 4 on that list. But I just wanted to highlight also why we have the expert review process and validation, and that's because 2 reasons. One, we feel that validators alone might not have the level of expertise required to, again, review all projects, types and situations on a global level and intervention types. But also because projects need to submit a PDD, and at some point they need confidence that the metrics that they are choosing are going to be accepted before they start collecting the data for that initial baseline assessment. So they start collecting their year 0 data. If they have to wait, and then when it comes to the validation, the validator would check the accuracy and how realistic that data is against what they can see on the ground. If they have to wait to validation to get assurance on those metrics, then there's a chance that they might be required to change the metrics and then have to redo all the data collection again, which requires a lot of resources and costs. So the idea is that we can give assurance prior to validation that the metrics are appropriate, and yes, you can invest that time and income into then collecting that initial set of data. And then finally, I guess on validation, the project must pass the validation stage before they can be officially registered and certified under PV Nature. But then once they are registered, they are operating as they described in that project design document, and they will be collecting their data as they described in that document as well. But every now and then we need continued checks, external checks. So at least every 5 years after registration, a verification must occur. Now, the purpose of a verification is to verify that the impacts that the projects are claiming around the monitoring data, etc., have been appropriate and do appear to be correct and robust based on a review and on the ground. But it will also check that the project is continuing to operate appropriately and any updates to the project documentation are accurate. And the verification can be completed by a validation and verification body, or through the Plan Vivo and independent expert combination process. So I'll explain what those ones are now that we get onto the final section of this. So like I keep saying, there's 2 routes to auditing under this standard. We're having VVBs, which are big, people who know the carbon markets will have an idea of who these are. They're often big auditing bodies, often international, with long-term experience of auditing follow projects, generally considered best practice within the carbon markets. So that's one side of the process, and they would have to, if they don't have certain expertise for a particular project type, they would be expected to subcontract appropriate consultants or academics or similar to gain that level of expertise. On the other side of this, another route or another track is to follow this Plan Vivo and independent expert process. Now, an independent expert is someone who has expertise and knowledge of the local project scenario where they're operating in terms of a cultural aspect, a societal understanding, and also the biota within that region and the interventions that are being applied. And then the audit process would occur with them visiting the site, but then oversight and support from Plan Vivo Foundation. What is the purpose for this other track? It's a track that we developed under the carbon standard as a way to reduce costs and barriers for small projects. Because I think, as people might know in this space, the auditing can be a large cost that ends up being a barrier to many projects becoming certified. And we wanted to provide that option on the biodiversity standard also. However, it's quite a bit harder to understand what is a small project on the biodiversity side. On the carbon side, we define it as those that are generating less than 10,000 tons of carbon benefits, CO2 benefits, sorry, per year. But that is harder to define on the biodiversity side, at least in these early days, when it comes to how many benefits projects might be generating and how comparable that is between projects. So we're allowing this track to be open to depending on what the project prefers. And we suggest that projects have conversations with their potential investors, their investors, and any potential future buyers of the certificates as to which route they would prefer. So that's it from me on the validation and verification requirements. Also, I'm going to pass back to Toril now, who's going to talk about the pilot projects and what the next steps are in terms of if you're interested in registering a project, but also for the public consultation and development of the standard.
Thank you, Luke. Okay, so to test and develop this standard as widely as possible, we've invited 7 pilot projects to apply against PV Nature. We've included a range of project types with different interventions and project design, including both biodiversity uplift and avoided loss projects. We also have included a range of project developers with projects in varying habitats and ecosystems in different ecoregions. So we have 2 projects in Honduras, a mangrove restoration project in the Bay of Fonseca, where widespread mangrove loss is being driven by a combination of shrimp farm development and firewood extraction. And the second is a cloud forest conservation project in the Kusuko National Park, which is recognized for its outstanding ecological importance. We actually have 3 projects in the global north, including a project in the Baía Estrela in Portugal, which aims to restore native wooded ecosystems by engaging the community in indigenous planting and reduce practices that inhibit natural regeneration. The project is located within Portugal's highest mountain range and largest natural park. The second project in the global north is in the UK, restoring the Solent seascape in England, recognized as an important area for biodiversity, with salt marsh, seagrass, and mudflat habitats, creating refuge for food for both fin and shellfish. However, has been heavily degraded since the 1860s. And our third project in the global north is protecting the high nature value grasslands of a rural Transylvania area and an important yet rare habitat in Europe. The landscape is a mosaic of wildflower-rich pastures and meadows, old-growth woodland, and also small-scale arable parcels, which has been maintained over centuries through low-intensity farming practices. Our 6th pilot project is from Sri Lanka, and we're working with this project to aim to restore the wildlife corridors of the Central Highlands, which is a project located in the tropical moist montane forest zone, a region actually regarded as one of the 36 recognized tropical hotspots of the world. And last but not least is our project in South Africa, located in the Fynbos. This is a conservation project within the Flower Valley of the Cape Floristic region, holding global botanical significance. So more information about each of these pilot projects will be available on our website from tomorrow after the webinar. Okay, so moving forward, once we have opened the standard to new project applications, I just wanted to illustrate the registration process and ensuring that we have a robust process with all the benefits being real, additional, and verifiable. So many of you who are familiar with our carbon standard will already be familiar with these steps and terminology, and we've tried to keep this as similar as possible within this new standard. So the first step is to get in touch with the Plan Vivo Secretariat and develop a project idea note. This is also known as a concept note, which usually takes about 3 months, but please note that these timeframes are an approximation and differ according to different projects. After the concept note has been approved, the next step is to start developing the project design document. And this is a detailed document. It's a living document which gets updated regularly and includes all the technical specifications around the biodiversity metrics and monitoring, as well as the comprehensive stakeholder analysis. Once we have received a complete PDD, the PDD goes out for external review by the review network. And only after that, all of the technical specifications and the biodiversity metrics and the PDD has been approved, do we recommend the biodiversity baselining. So this process takes anywhere between 6 to 10 months, but sometimes longer. And once the PDD has been approved, that's when a third-party validation occurs, as Luke has just explained, including a site visit to the project area to ground truth all the details of the project design document. And once this validation, upon passing this validation, a project officially becomes registered under Plan Vivo Nature. After validation, there is an opportunity to scale up, and also the annual reporting takes place with after 5 years, after the first validation, the project will undergo another third-party verification, which often will follow with the issuance of the Plan Vivo biodiversity certificates. So the next steps from here, well, first we'll be taking the time to read and incorporate all the feedback we received from today and the public consultation process, which is open for a month. And then we will continue to be working with our pilot projects to develop all the technical aspects and the external reviews. We're working to continue to provide guidance around different aspects of the standard documentation, guidance on submitting new biodiversity methodologies, also different tools for different biodiversity monitoring techniques, and also looking for different guidance around different aspects. We're also continuing to develop our review network with different expertise being involved. So if you feel like you want to be considered for this as a reviewer, please let us know via the feedback form, which will be available on our website. And the upcoming timeline is that in Q1 of this year, we'll be continuing to develop the standard with all of the feedback and consultation, with the aim to open for new projects in Q2 of this year. So that brings us to the end of this presentation. Finally, just to say a big thank you for everyone for listening, and a reminder that this webinar recording will be on our website tomorrow morning. We will also have all the draft documentation online where you can download it and look through all the details. We've tried to cover a very high level aspect of all the documentation, but all the details will be there in writing, and you can please submit your feedback via the feedback form, including some of the questions we may not get time to address today. For any further information, please contact biodiversity@planvivofoundation.org. So now I will pass it back to Luke to chair the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Tol. Exactly 1 hour. Well, minus the 2 minutes it took us to get started, so I think we've done quite well there. We've had a large number of questions come in already, 75 and counting. So just to set expectations about how many we can get to, I've tried my best to try and group some together into some general questions that can be put to the panelists. Hopefully can cover a few of the questions at once. I will say though, some of them are quite technical, which we feel that might be better answered either from just looking at the documentation tomorrow, because it goes into kind of the core heart of the document and the specific parts, or if it's not answered through there, we recommend that maybe you provide that as feedback in the public consultation via that feedback form. So I guess going into questions, I'm going to try and group 2 of them together, which are around costs and how much will we get for, paid as a project. So the first one, well, I'll start with the payment ones. I think there's some questions around when will projects get paid and how much will they get paid for their certificates. Maybe Torvald, if you want to take if it's possible, when the projects might expect money, and I'm happy to kind of talk about maybe pricing around certificates.
Yeah, sure. So certificates will be issued based on the data collected, obviously after demonstrating that the biodiversity benefits have been achieved, and this will happen after a verification. Verifications will happen at least every 5 years after the registration, and so certificates, the issuance of certificates will likely match this. For projects to access finance earlier, this could be either through investment funding or forward sales. And once projects have received some of this income, they may be able to like stage the payments based on performance being met through the metrics and through the progress indicators.
Super, thank you. Yeah, so I guess then a bit more on the other part of that people have been asking is like, well, how much income per certificate? It's not the easiest to say at the moment. This is an emerging market at the end of the day. We've done our best. We've had Kristen leading the kind of market analysis side of this, and we've been constantly trying to ask the potential buyer side of the market these types of questions. And there's essentially no clear answer on the exact amount per certificate, except that there's a general consensus that maybe in these early days, the best way that pricing can be built is that projects are very transparent about their costs. So projects can create financial models around the amount of costs that they are expecting and the amount of biodiversity benefits that they're expecting. Then you can create some sort of system in which you can put out there, well, to make this project happen, this is how much you would have to pay us per certificate, and then base the models around that. We've spoken to a few buyers about this, and they've been relatively welcoming to that, I think, without knowing the finer details of what that number might actually turn out to be. Yeah, so hopefully those two questions have answered a group of them around that. On the other side, on the cost side, in terms of how much would it cost to actually certify a project, I can talk more about the registration process, maybe. Yeah, maybe Keith, would you be able to talk a bit more about the project development, like how the costs can actually be covered, maybe? I think that relates a bit more to the sales as well, though. So I can do the former first, if you like. So how much does it cost to certify and register a project? There's two types of costs involved in these types of things. There's the cost to us, or this is how we would categorize them. There's the cost to us as the certifier and our processes, which we don't currently have publicized for the Plan Vivo nature, but we're going to align it as closely as we can to our carbon standard. So if you want to have an idea about the cost there, then I'd say take a look at the costs for the carbon standard. The other costs, though, are more associated, I'd say, with external matters. So when it comes to developing its staff input, collecting data, that depends on what your metrics look like, what your data collection processes are. How much support does the project need in terms of how much capacity do they have internal, and how much will they need to hire from externals? These are all things that we can't really tell anyone. At the end of the day, just that last point alone about how much support is needed, it's like how long is a piece of string sometimes. So I imagine it would be maybe similar then to a carbon project, if not maybe slightly more expensive, because I think there's more to monitor, especially in those early days. But it's a bit hard for us to say otherwise. Keith, maybe some thoughts on the how they might be able to pay for this upfront cost.
Sure, thanks, Luke. Yeah, I mean, I think Torvald touched a little bit on it, answering how long will it take for projects to receive things. So as with carbon projects, there's usually a gap, could be 5 years, where the project is waiting to issue credits to be sold. As a lot of you will know, in the carbon and the voluntary carbon market, the mechanism of ex-ante credits has been used in the past as a way to bring in upfront finance. We've decided here, at least initially, that this in the biodiversity standard, there would be no ex-ante equivalent here. So projects would have to find other funding to cover that development cost. The reason for that, well, a number of reasons, but one, we've had lots of feedback from people saying that they actually feel like there's a lot of funding available for these type of projects, be that conservation funding or development funding, and also from the market, a lot of willingness to upfront fund some of these projects without having an actual credit yet. So we feel there is a lot of potential there. I mean, maybe there's an opportunity here for some organizations to be involved to help create this, but there's a feeling that there is a lot of funding available for project development. I guess a key advantage of biodiversity certificates or credits are that they provide a market mechanism to channel finance into this space. So it means for a conservation funding program, they would only have to fund the upfront development, and then the finance generated from the biodiversity credits would kick in then. So that's the mechanism I think that these projects are looking at. And our pilot projects certainly have been able to find ways to bring in that upfront funding. Now, yeah, still early days, as Luke said, in terms of this market and in terms of what the opportunities are.
Thanks, Keith. If I can keep you talking as well, sorry. We had a question around, I guess, so I think you've talked about the demand more now, but do you think that demand's going to take away from the carbon side as well? Or do you think it's an addition?
Yeah, a good question. I mean, we had quite a lot of discussions within the working group on this, and also with existing carbon projects and carbon buyers. Our feeling is that this is a different market. So the market for carbon offsets is still strong, is still big, and there's a high demand for Plan Vivo certificates or high value certificates that are delivering these co-benefits. So we feel that it's kind of, it's not replacing, the biodiversity credits are not replacing the carbon market in this case. And we have, if you look on our projects page, you'll see quite a few projects really are very good at talking about the biodiversity benefits. And because of that, Plan Vivo certificates get a higher than average price per ton of CO2 emission reduction in the voluntary carbon market. I still think that's going to exist. What we see is that this new market is very much looking for additional biodiversity. They want a biodiversity credit, and they want additional monitoring and reassurance on the level of detail of the biodiversity impact that's been achieved. With that comes a lot of cost, and that's why we've kind of looked at it as a separate offering within the market alongside the carbon as well. So to answer the question, I think there's demand for both. They're different markets, and I think, yeah, I think there's even opportunity for both to grow in the coming years, looking at the demand for high quality offsets as well.
Thank you, Keith. We had a question come in about, I think it was clarifying what this 1% change in biodiversity is. I'm happy to take this one. Like, is it a 1% change against the starting biodiversity, or 1% change against a target ecosystem? Like what you would expect, kind of like a carrying capacity of the ecosystem to be. I think so this was a decision that we had to come to early on. I say us, the Wallacea Trust as well. I mean, they were the one leading the methodology. It's a change against a baseline, whether the baseline, if it's an uplift, it's what it was at the beginning of the project. I'm saying I'm oversimplifying some things here. There are some caveats to this, but for the sake of brevity, I won't go into that. But it's a change against the baseline, so if that's an uplift, or a change against a potential avoided loss state if the project wasn't going to occur. There were plenty of conversations that were had around, well, can it not be against what that ecosystem carrying capacity is supposed to be? But we determined after talking to a lot of ecologists as well that it's very hard to estimate what the carrying capacity of an environment is supposed to be, especially prior to which is supposed to be what the levels were prior to human driven degradation, which is hard to find because when humans started to influence an environment is a difficult point to assess. So then you've got lots of subjectivity around what the baseline historically is, and then how can we collect that data? Some places it's easier, some places it's harder. Hopefully to avoid any risks associated with this is that any population data is supposed to be across a large number of species, so that it's not just a case of focusing on one species to generate biodiversity certificates over and above what would be a healthy amount for that ecosystem. It's about looking across a very large number of species and populations to represent those biodiversity levels. And then this is all assessed through that review process that we talked about earlier. And also we'd have some safeguarding in place to prevent environmental harm associated with these things. So hopefully that is a sufficient answer for you. We've had some as well about, I think, that role of the community engagement within these projects. So Toril, is that okay to hand over to you? So how is the community expected to get involved with the project? For example, like with the monitoring, what are the requirements around this?
Yeah, so through the stakeholder consultation process, the community have to be consulted and engaged throughout the project design and the project logic at a very early stage. And through these consultations, the local community should have the opportunity to define, discuss the conservation objectives and importance of the site. So what may be more important to the people of that area should be documented in that stakeholder analysis. And so during the project, the local community can engage in the biodiversity aspect through different mechanisms. The first is through the actual participation of the data collection. Of course, this is not always going to be the same depending on the project. They may be able to engage in the monitoring of the progress indicators on an annual basis, monitoring and reporting of that. And also they could be included in an additional metric, maybe a more citizen science style monitoring. Maybe that's not included in the 5 basket of metrics, biodiversity metrics that are selected under the methodology, but they have an opportunity to feed into other metrics that may be more pertinent to them and to the area they live in. So it's not totally prescribed, but what we are wanting to see is that comprehensive and inclusive stakeholder engagement with the community to really identify the biodiversity benefits and objectives of that area to them as well.
Super, thank you. We've had quite a few, I've noticed, asking for greater clarity around what I said about that the methodology that we're going to have on the website will differ from the OPWAL or the Wallacea Trust version. So again, I'm happy to take that one. The primary difference is the only, I'd argue, major difference is that there's a more concrete or a new, baselining section to help projects baseline, and this then helps give justification to certain assumptions within the methodology that are made. And this is something we can work with the Wallacea Trust as well. They are happy with this in our version as well. They've approved all these changes, so we're not misrepresenting anything in their eyes. But then the other changes are mainly just around aligning it with our processes, our other documents. So certain terms that we use, we wanted to align their methodology to use our terms so that it matches between documents, definitions, processes such as the use of the risk buffer, etc. So I guess the other things are a bit smaller in that regard. But hopefully that gives some ideas. Again, you can compare the 2 documents if you like tomorrow, and you can get our version and then put them next to each other if you want to look at the finer detail. So a next question that's come in. Let's have a look. Sorry. I was wondering if you could tell us, sorry, I'll give this to you, Keith. Actually, no. No, I'll give it to Toril if that's okay, sorry. I was wondering, you let off the hook, Keith. We've got some people asking about how this can work alongside a potential carbon project. Like, is this a dual? Is this a potential for dual finance, additional finance, or is it an either or situation?
Yeah, sure. So at the moment, our positioning is that yes, we would consider projects to both apply under our carbon standard and biodiversity standard, or also known as stacking carbon and biodiversity. We're currently working on what this looks like through our pilot projects with requirements around this. They're all detailed in our project requirements document. Briefly, the approach we're taking where projects want to stack is that this will only be allowed if that project is not already issuing carbon credits from that project area. And it is being managed by the same project developer. And this is purely for ease of management, not just for us as a standard setter, but also for the project itself. And then we also need to ensure that we want projects to demonstrate that they're doing additional activities over and above what they're doing for carbon. If they are intending to apply under both standards, they need to show that they're doing additional activities over and above what they're doing for one standard. And that's really to meet their additionality demand.
Super, thank you. Can I have you keep talking for a second question, a follow-up one on a different topic, but a few people have kind of asked in and around this expert review network. I was just wondering if you could give an idea around the types of people that might be on that network, and like where in development it is and things like that. Maybe this is an opportunity to potentially find some recruits as well.
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, so as Luke had explained in the presentation, there will be a core review network, which is made up of biodiversity specialists that are familiar with Plan Vivo. And I mean, it's still in development stage, so we are working towards recruiting the right people for the right place. And the core reviewers will be more familiar with Plan Vivo as a standard, our core values, and also the methodology, and also will be helping us to source the complementary reviewers that will be more from the local region or the project region with biodiversity expertise that's more specific to that project, the biodiversity metrics that are selected. And this will be a much broader group in order to cover the array of biodiversity projects that we may receive and different expertise. So we're still in the process of developing this review network, and we're looking for projects, our pilot projects, to help us find relevant reviewers for their own projects. And we are also looking for other expertise in the area to come forward and, you know, share their areas of specialism, so we can develop a very robust review network. I would like to say as well that we are trying to align with a lot of national and regional objectives. And so trying to build this review network will hopefully push us more towards that. So projects in the same area can, you know, have a similar reviewer or similar objectives, and therefore kind of standardize what we're doing across the board. Hopefully that was clear.
No, thank you very much. My next one I might give to you, Keith, if that's okay. I think it was a more general one. I think this is going to be a bit more of a position-based question. So it might relate more to our positioning that we put out with FFI. But it's someone saying, I think someone's made a comment that, well, there's a potential risk here that the market pushes just to generate a windfall of credits, as they put it. So what are kind of the core values that we would expect, I guess, like safeguard core values, principles, etc., to keep the integrity of this market high as it's emerging? What would we say they are as, I guess, our position to the market?
Sure, Luke. Yeah, I mean, I think I would refer people to the link in that presentation for more detail, because we did spend quite a bit of time with FFI trying to really put down what we think are, obviously there's a lot of opportunity here, but there's also a lot of risks if this isn't done well. So the guiding principles we put together in that document are really about setting those down on paper. And again, they're framed around those kind of people, nature, and climate. And but there's a lot more detail in there. And I think we want to really safeguard against the same kind of criticisms that are often put on carbon projects about, you know, communities not being engaged, and you know, land ownership, land rights not being respected, about lots of money being generated and then the money not flowing down to the people who are kind of running the projects and delivering on the ground. So we've tried to structure these principles around that, but also what we found, and you know, from our experience in the VCM, is it's great to talk about that, but if you haven't written that into the standard, it doesn't happen, or it's not guaranteed to happen. So we also have to make sure that we have these high level principles, and we want to engage in discussions so that the whole market is looked on in that way, that people are asking, where's the benefit sharing in these projects? Where, if these projects have potential to generate this much income to go towards conservation, is it really happening? So we want to have those conversations, but we don't want to just talk about it. We want to have a mechanism in place that makes sure that that's tracked and that's transparent and that you can see that's happening. So I think it's two things. It's about setting the position, and then it's about backing it up with requirements that make sure that projects are monitored against that. And if projects cannot demonstrate that, then they can no longer generate, in this case, biodiversity certificates through us. So yeah, I would say we can send the link out as well for more details and have a look. But I think us, FFI, many others as well, Carbon Tanzania, who contributed as well. So we've got projects contributing from on the ground experience as well over what you need to have in place to make sure this happens.
Thank you, Keith. We've had a few people asking around, I say, risk associated questions, buffer associated questions. So I can quickly try to answer that one. So we would be requiring a contribution to a buffer that operates on the Plan Vivo level. Projects are required to contribute 20% of generated certificates to that, and that is then to give some greater assurance to buyers in the case of unforeseen, unavoidable losses, such as the likes of wildfires, that aren't a requirement to be managed under the project's plans, or similar issues, you know, conflict, etc., causing a loss of biodiversity. The specifics around that, we're going to try and match quite similar to the carbon standard on how those types of buffers have operated, which we're also releasing new procedures for shortly. So we would suggest, we've not created those procedures for this standard yet, but again, to give an idea of what that might look like, we'd suggest taking a look at the carbon standard and how those types of risks are managed there. We've had more questions around the community side. I think a few people interested in this. So one was asking around to what extent will local communities be involved in selecting the metrics, and to what extent do they have to actually monitor as well? Like how much, I guess almost how much power is being given to the communities and how much has to be kind of on their shoulders. Toril, is that one okay for you?
Yeah, sure. I think I sort of covered this in the last question. No worries. But just to reiterate, yeah, the community involvement, first of all, needs to be determined through the stakeholder consultation and process, the stakeholder analysis, and they should have enough opportunity to feed into what the biodiversity metrics that they see as most important or most relevant is, and how that aligns with the wider project objectives. But the participation, as I mentioned before, can vary depending on how they prefer to engage. So it could be on actually collecting the data, or it could be on collecting information on the progress indicators on an annual basis. This is mainly because we think collecting biodiversity metric data on an annual basis will be too expensive. So projects will likely indicate some progress indicators that they see that they would be able to measure on an annual basis to at least continue to recognize the biodiversity benefits and also the socioeconomic and environmental, the wider environmental benefits happening on an annual basis. So yeah, I think there isn't a clear one-way option for community engagement, but it needs to be a very free, informed, prior consent opportunity for all people in the project area, all the local stakeholders to get involved.
Yeah, sorry if I've made you repeat anything there. I think it's sometimes
No
a
problem.
context of trying to listen and look at the new questions again as they come in. We had some questions around size of projects that works under Plan Vivo. I'd say that, so under this methodology, the one by Wallacea Trust, there is a minimum size of 50 hectares. This was something that was consulted quite a bit within the working group that they operated. I think the idea was just to try and prevent, large gardens being submitted under this system. But otherwise, there isn't a limit on scale that these projects can operate over, as long as, if they are quite small, close to that 50 hectare mark, we would require some sort of financial model. This is something that we do in the carbon standard as well. It's just to make sure that these projects are financially feasible and they aren't going to cause, waves and problems with the participants or investors, etc., if they collapsed after a few years of operating. So that would essentially be down to the project to demonstrate to us. Beyond that, there's no limit on size. I have a question as well on, I think is a fairly good question around what steps can you make to prevent or control. So taking a step back, we're saying that these aren't offsets. We don't want these to be used in an offset manner because we don't feel that you can equate loss of biodiversity in one area that's local to some people to gain in another that's local to some other different people, amongst other reasons. Someone said, what can we actually do to control or prevent this from happening? Do we have any control over the use of them in an offsetting manner through communications? Is that okay for you to take, Keith?
Sure. Yeah, I'm answering a few online as well. I think, this is the same challenge we have in the carbon world as well, right? And the way we address it on the carbon side is, as a standard, we only issue PVCs, Plan Vivo certificates, onto a registry, and that registry, people who want to trade those Plan Vivo certificates can only do it through that registry. That means they have to have an account on the registry, and they have to then, in the case of Plan Vivo, they have to sign a reseller or buyer agreement, which means they have to sign up to what their purpose is for purchasing the credits, which includes that they're only using them for offsetting unavoidable emissions, that they're only making claims in line with best practice, and so on. So I can imagine we'll have a similar approach for biodiversity certificates here. There's always a big question, though, in terms of even if somebody follows that, they can go and report something in the media, which you can't really control. And obviously we can't, as a standard, control that. All we can do is keep track of the credits on a registry, and that when somebody purchases them, that they're allocated and retired, so that they cannot be double accounting and all these sort of things. Obviously, if we hear of somebody, in this case, it's a bit different because it's not been used for, we don't want it to be used for any offset. And even the whole understanding of how biodiversity credits could be used for offsets and biodiversity net gain and all of these things are still being developed. So I guess part of it is making sure that we're up to speed on all these other initiatives, and making sure that any of the projects we're working with are aligned with that. And if they want to generate something for biodiversity net gain, then they'll have to follow a different set of guidelines that won't be achievable through Plan Vivo. So yeah, so it's a bit of one of us having to have clear process in place, clear visibility and transparency, and then I guess tracking who can and can't purchase Plan Vivo certificates.
Thank you. And if I can squeeze in one tiny response from you before I'm going to have to finish, because we've come to the end of our time, linking to that, and I think you may have mentioned this early on in the presentation, but then who do you think are the buyers of these, if not for offsets? Who are buying them and what are they using them for?
Yeah, good. Well, so we had, as I mentioned, that we had a working group. We also have, given so much interest, we ended up setting up a market working group. And there we have representatives from different people in the space who are interested in buying these. Sometimes it's companies who want to be able to have an impact on biodiversity. It may be part of their CSR. It could be also impact investors who, again, see an advantage in being able to contribute to biodiversity. Some are maybe more forward-looking and thinking that it's actually having positive impact on nature is intrinsically linked to their business plan and their mission, so they're trying to do it for that. So it's a range, and we're still trying to understand the whole market. And I think there were some questions in there saying, is this demand real? All these sort of things. And, you know, we speak to, all the different, you know, stakeholders are all saying there's high demand. We have all these claims about how much the funding gap is, but I think until we have something out there, then the proof will be in the pudding to see if there really is a demand for it. And yeah, everyone's telling us there is, and I think what we have to do is to make sure we're generating high integrity credits that are what people are telling us they want, and then we have to see what the demand really is. But it does feel like a lot of people are in the market for this, and it's not just one set of stakeholders, it's quite a range of different people.
Thanks, Keith, for that. And I think we're going to have to leave it there then. We've gone over just trying to squeeze in a few extra questions. I'm so sorry if I didn't get to your question. There were just so many. I tried to group them where I could, but sometimes it's easier said than done. I'd like to thank everyone for coming, though, today. If the questions weren't answered, please take a look at the documents tomorrow. They might be able to provide a bit more information and answer them yourselves. We encourage everyone to take a look at the documents anyway. If they still haven't been answered, you're welcome to put it in the feedback document, because we're going to try and respond to the groups of questions we get in that feedback publicly. But if it's more urgent than that, you're more than welcome to email us at biodiversity@planvivofoundation.org. So biodiversity@planvivofoundation.org. Like I said, please take a look at the documents, provide your thoughts. Like, we try to make this as best as possible, this standard, but we really need everyone's feedback from a wider range of the network and the emerging market. So any input you can provide would be great. Otherwise, yeah, thank you from the Plan Vivo team for joining us today and on this, what we hope is a milestone in this sector as it embarks on the journey into the voluntary biodiversity markets. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks for